All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling a huge topic, reparations, but we're going to look at it through a completely different lens, one that comes from our source material. The idea here is to frame this not just as an argument about the past, but as a really practical question about the future.
So, to get our heads around this, let's start with a simple question that's actually pretty deep. What is the real difference between a game and a war? It might sound a little abstract, I know, but stick with me, because the answer is at the absolute heart of this whole idea.
Think about it. In a game, like any sport, everybody agrees on the rules. There's a clock, there are fouls, and when it's over, it's over. And the most important part? Next season, everybody starts over. Everything resets. A war, on the other hand, is what happens when those rules totally break down. The goal becomes complete domination, and it can just escalate forever. The key difference here? A game has a reset button.
So what happens when we apply that exact same idea to society? What happens when our big competitions, in economics and politics, don't have a clock, when there's no seasonal reset?
Well, the argument in the source material is that without these resets, things like the ancient idea of a jubilee year, where debts were forgiven, advantages just keep compounding. Generation after generation, wealth, power, and opportunity all start to pile up in the same places. Winners become locked in, and for everyone else, the game starts to feel rigged. It slowly stops feeling like healthy competition and starts to feel more like a kind of quiet, endless conflict.
You can actually map out how this decay happens. It all starts with healthy competition, but as those advantages stack up over time, the rules themselves start to feel fundamentally unfair. And eventually, you get to a point where a whole lot of people feel like there's just no point in playing by the rules at all. And that, right there, is the dangerous moment when competition can curdle into real, open conflict.
And this leads us to the core warning in this whole framework. Without these ways of rebalancing the board, of hitting a reset, what we call competition eventually just becomes another word for conquest, a zero-sum fight for total control.
So, if that's the problem, what on earth is the solution? Well, this brings us to a really powerful new way of thinking about how to bring a reset back into our societal game.
And here it is. This is the central idea. The proposal is to think of reparations as that halftime whistle. See, it's not about ending the game. It's a deliberate pause to rebalance the field, check the equipment, and maybe change the rules that are broken, all to make sure the second half can actually be played fairly.
Now, this framework means we have to really change how we define reparations. It makes them completely forward-looking. They're deliberate acts that change the current rules, resources, and institutions. So the goal isn't just to settle up with the past, it's to make sure that future generations get to play on a fundamentally fairer field.
The entire focus just flips. The conversation moves from being mostly about settling an old historical debt to being a massive, strategic investment in a more stable, a more fair, and a more productive future for absolutely everyone.
Okay, so this all sounds good in theory, right? But what is fixing the foundation? What does hitting that reset button actually look like in the real world?
Well, the source material lays out a pretty detailed, multi-part approach. It's not just one thing. It combines the tangible stuff, like restitution of land or targeted capital investments, with the really big systemic changes. We're talking deep policy shifts in things like housing and education, plus institutional reforms and truth commissions to reshape the entire story. It's a comprehensive overhaul, not just a simple check.
And the strategy for making this reset actually last is key. It's designed in layers. So you might start with individual compensation where that makes sense, but then you build on it with collective institutions, like community trusts, which can grow and compound benefits for generations. And then you lock all those gains in with permanent policy changes that are really hard to just undo later.
So we've got the concept and we've got the potential mechanics. Now let's talk about some of the major questions and objections that an idea this big is obviously going to bring up.
So how does this framework respond to some of the common critiques? Well, to the argument that it's all about the past, it says, no, this is about stopping past harm from continuing to structure our present. To the very real concern that it's unaffordable, it flips the question and asks, what's the current cost of inequality? In lost GDP, in healthcare, in incarceration? And to the question of who pays, the answer here is the state, using public budgets, trusts, and tax reform.
At the end of the day, this reframing is an attempt to turn what is often seen as a purely moral argument into a deeply practical one. The idea is that the moral claim gets real traction when it's translated into pragmatic programs.
when it's seen less as punishment and more as a form of critical societal infrastructure policy, designed to literally change the future trajectory of communities and the country.
And this brings us right back to where we started, leaving us with a final, really big question to chew on. If we accept the analogy that society is a kind of infinite game that we are all playing, then what rules, what resets are truly necessary to make sure that game stays fair, competitive, and stable for all the generations who are going to have to play after us?